Good morning, everyone. I hope you had a good weekend and that everything is going well for you, and that hopefully you survived Hurricane Laura with little damage and nobody, hurt or injured or anything like that. And now we got to get back at it. You had a couple days to kind of recoup, and we get to move on. Now, if you remember, we talked about the Earth and the different like plate tectonic zones and like the shape and like structure of the earth. Well, today we're going to be discussing more of the world's like water. And water is kind of a big deal because the earth is 70% of it. So this is something that we definitely have to cover, especially in regards to geography, which again is the study of the earth. Now, here's the thing that there's many different types of bodies of water. So you have like the Caspian Sea, which is in southeastern Europe and southwestern Asia, is actually a salt lake, meaning that it is an enclosed body of water made up of salt water. And this is unusual because most bodies of water that are salty are typically connected to the ocean. And you have a few of these around the world. And you have like Lake Eyre in Australia, Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela, the Great Salt Lake in Utah, and you've also got the Dead Sea in Israel. And these are different areas that are completely enclosed and for various reasons have a salty water content. And we'll discuss more of that later on throughout the year when we get to those areas. But just know that these salt lakes, while unusual, are not unheard of, and there's a few in pretty much there's at least one in most continents. Now, when we talk about water, we're talking about a specific part of the earth called the hydrosphere. This is the area that is covered by water, so the oceans, essentially. Now, most of it's found in salt water, which is found in oceans, seas, and as I said earlier, some lakes. The rest of the hydrosphere is fresh water, lakes, rivers, springs, basically the bodies of water that sustain humanity and pretty much most life on the planet Earth. There are some creatures, of course, like, sea life that can live in the oceans no problem. Now, the sun's heat evaporates water, which remains in the air until the air cools. And so this is what we know as the water cycle, meaning that the earth is constantly cycling water through it. And this is it's part of how the sky ends up looking blue because there's water circling through it. It helps keep the air cool. This is how we get our weather patterns, or at least part of how we get our weather patterns, because the cool air will then return to earth in the form of rain, snow, or sleet, meaning that it's going to come back, enter the ground, or hit the oceans or any body of water and just start the cycle over again. And the total volume of the hydrosphere remains relatively constant because evaporated water eventually returns to the earth as precipitation. Rain, snow, sleet, anything like basically water that returns to the earth. That's precipitation. Now, the overwhelming majority of the hydrosphere is the oceans. This is 97%. It's huge. And it's 4 major sections, even though it's really all one huge body of water that's connected. We still have demarcated it into 4 major pieces. We have the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian, and the Arctic Oceans. And each of those oceans has different characteristics that we attach to it. But for the most part, it's all one big body of water. And as I said, there are large bodies of salt water that are that are completely enclosed by land, but then there are some that are partially enclosed, which include your seas, your gulfs, your bays. So one that you're probably most familiar with would be, say, like the Gulf of Mexico. But if you travel to, say, Maryland, you'd be around Chesapeake Bay, which means that there's land around good chunks of it, but it's still a saltwater entity. Now, here's the thing. Most ocean water is undrinkable. We can't actually use it as people. And because of a great demand for drinking water, we have started to experiment with the process called desalination, which is the removal of salt from ocean water. Basically, we make the ocean water drinkable. I mean, it's kind of crazy that water in many places is considered a scarce resource when 70% of the planet is covered by it. But it's that whole, phrase, water, water everywhere, not a drop to drink. Meaning that there are places where fresh water is scarce, but there's tons of water around, island countries and such. So people have had to come up with ways to do that. And one of the more recent ones is that they take these giant processors and machines and heat the water up, remove the salt, and then filter it back through like evaporated air until it comes back and liquefied as water. Now, as far as fresh water goes, only 3% of the hydrosphere is fresh water. And what's crazy is that most of it is actually in glaciers and ice caps, which is inaccessible to most people. Meaning that your lakes, rivers, streams, ponds, bayous, all that are only like less, only probably about 1%, maybe 1.5% of our available water supply in the world. Again, it's kind of crazy because you think about, like, say, the Mississippi River or the Red River, that's a lot of water. And it's still only, that's less than 1%. Now, just a couple of terms you need to be aware of. You have lakes, streams, and rivers. A lake is actually a body of fresh water completely surrounded by land, meaning if it has an outlet point, it's not a lake anymore. It's something else. Very few lakes are made of salt water. Most are fresh water. Streams are actually narrow bodies of water that flow through areas of land, whereas rivers are larger versions of the same things. And then, there's some other terms that you'll see, like a bayou, which is essentially the same thing as a stream or a river. It's just, it has a much more fluid name. Like there are things that would probably be considered rivers in other parts of the world that we call a bayou. And same thing, streams that are bayous. Gotta love Louisiana sometimes. But because these streams and rivers carry through land, like they flow through the land, they carry fresh water to people and animals. They also carry fish, which are a major source of food for many people around the world. And most animals and people live near sources of fresh water. Remember how I said that most cities established near some sort of body of water? Typically, it's fresh water. I mean, the earliest civilizations, the ancient Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, they were establishing near rivers, which provided water to help create fertile land, crops, provided fishing, and it also brought other creatures that people then used to survive. And again, like if you look in the United States, a lot of our major cities are near a major body of water. I mean, there's at least 6 major cities along the Mississippi River alone. And then there's also groundwater, which is fresh water lying beneath the surface. So if any of y'all have a well at your house or know someone who has a well, they have found a source of groundwater and they use that to provide their fresh water. Now, this is a little bit unusual nowadays, but it's not uncommon, or it's not unheard of. And then there are natural springs and handmade wells that allow people to retrieve this groundwater. So, you'll hear about like natural springs that water's bottled from and stuff. I don't know how accurate that is, but they claim to use groundwater and spring water for their sources, like Ozarka, for example, or Dasani. And then there are handmade wells that people make, again, to retrieve and create access to this groundwater. Okay, and that's the end of the section today. I hope you are able to follow along, and I hope you're keeping up with everything. And tomorrow we will have the quiz on this section, so be ready for it. It will be online and in person, depending upon who is here that day. So it should be a B day tomorrow, and I will see you then.